This is precisely the challenge of 21st century politics. Technological progress has made it so comfortable for people to conform that demands for radical and fundamental change seem like lunacy. Every day, people in Saudi Arabia and even communist China, whatever you want to say, wake up and say, well, a revolution is in order, but not me, not now, not today. And what we've seen happen in France, and it still is happening right now in 2019, is a whole bunch of people who wake up. Yes, ultimately, the spark that set these events in motion is somewhat trivial. It was the rising price of gasoline and tax on gasoline. Some number of tens of thousands of people woke up and said, you know what, the system is so fundamentally bad that a revolution is in order, and you know what, it's going to be me. It's going to be now. It's going to be today. I squeeze jet, I squeeze jet, I squeeze jet, I squeeze jet, I squeeze jet. Till my clips is done. Till my clips is done. I squeeze jet, till my clips is done. I squeeze jet, till my clips is done. I think what makes the outside world, I don't know, so uncomfortable with the example of the Gilets jaunes is precisely the sense that if this can happen in France, it can happen anywhere. I squeeze jet, till my clips is done. Till my clips is done. I squeeze jet, till my clips is done. I squeeze jet, till my clips is done. If I told you there was an uprising of the disgruntled poor or even the disgruntled middle class in South Sudan, anyone would sit there and look at the footage and kind of in a smug way say, yes, well, I told you so. I always saw this coming. You know, sorry, if you just look at footage of what life is like right now in South Sudan, people are living in huts, they have dirt roads, they have objectively very hard conditions. And that makes it safer for us to sympathize with their political struggle if they're demanding change. And there's a strange kind of irony that the privileged white Western world has a great deal of trouble sympathizing with discontent, with really deep discontent and demands for radical political change when it comes from privileged white Western people. However, we contrast that to the possibility of a movement that is in a perpetual state of mutiny, a perpetual state of directionlessness and leaderlessness, a movement that is in a sense always subverting itself, and where we can't even measure their success or failure relative to goals because they never did clearly set out the goals. Hey guys, I'm going through a transition with the format on my channel, and my motto is active research and informed opinion. But I'm also going to spin off a few other running series for videos that perhaps neither represent active research nor informed opinion. I often feel like I could do an infinite series of videos that just reflect the last 40 years of research I did, because some of those issues keep coming up in my life and in politics and scholarship and in books I read again and again and again. So you're going to have one series called Petty Deep. A lot of ideas. Some of them come out of academia. Some of them come out of Western political discourse, what have you. And they're ideas that people treat as deep and they're really petty, or they're ideas that are a little bit profound, but people are using them in a petty way. That's going to be one ongoing series of videos. And then I'm going to do another one that's just called Zero Research, where I'm doing a video and I want to have in the title disclaiming, look guys, I'm not going to live up to my own hype here. I'm going to talk about my own opinion. This is going to reflect maybe books I read 20 years ago. That's how it is when you get to my age. Sometimes you're half remembering research you did 20 years ago on a topic, but I gotta talk. And I'm gonna talk sometimes with zero original research to back me up, or just the ghosted memory of research from the distant past. Anyway, so that's what you got in store here today. The rise of France's Yellow Jacket movement brings to mind a long, strange intellectual legacy in Western academia of what's called acephalous leadership. You should be suspicious right away. I mean, whenever people use this type of intentionally obfuscatory, obtuse, Greco-Latin term in politics, you got to ask, why is it, homie? Why is it, homie, you can't just tell us what you mean? What do you mean acephalous leadership? What the hell are you talking about? In my mind, again, reflecting reading over decades and decades, the one name that comes up right away is the kind of master charlatan of British academia, James C. Scott. So James C. Scott had a hit book back when he was more or less openly a crypto-communist called The Weapons of the Weak. And you have to know a little bit about communism to get the extent to which he was a communist at the time he wrote that book. He had that hit book, and then many, many years went by. Communism went out of fashion. Understatement of the year. And he tried to reinvent himself as a kind of theoretician of anarchism. And it's interesting because if he had done that maybe just 10 or 15 years earlier, the label he no doubt would have used would have been anarcho-primitivism. But anarcho-primitivism itself had already gone out of style. And among the great, needlessly obfuscatory words that he managed to make seem romantic and relevant in politics again was this concept of acephalous leadership. In a sense, this is a consistent theme throughout his work, starting from Weapons of the Weak and then going through his attempt to construct a pseudo-history out of bits and pieces of anecdotes about basically European colonial powers arriving in Southeast Asia, and their somewhat romanticized and at the same time somewhat denigrating and racist descriptions of the quote-unquote savages living in a situation of quote-unquote anarchy. So acephalous, it means headless, means you're having a revolution, rebellion, insurrection, or some kind of political movement that has no leader. Now, in working from primarily British colonial accounts of Southeast Asia, isn't it convenient to be able to describe indigenous people as leaderless when you, as the conquering army, simply have no interest in negotiating with them? You have no interest in having an end to the hostilities. Isn't it convenient for the British Empire to describe tribes as anarchic? I don't think they would use anarchist in this ideological sense, when in reality they're incredibly hierarchical structured societies that have headmen, it's an ironic, headless and headmen, that have chieftains, that have local kings, that rule over them with a level of totalitarian control that's actually far beyond what's in our sort of science fiction dystopias about a totalitarian future. And irony of ironies, who should appreciate the type of control, the type of political control that exists in those traditional societies? Maybe not people in political science, maybe not people in sociology, definitely people in the discipline of anthropology. And it is tragically from the academic position of social anthropology that James C. Scott managed to foist this illusion or delusion on the world, romanticizing leaderless resistance, acephalous movements, so on and so forth. The example of the yellow vests in France right now, the yellow jackets, the gilets jaunes, however you want to say this, the example shows you precisely the disadvantages of a leaderless movement in the 21st century. And I find it very embarrassing that I see one hatchet job after another, most recently the Atlantic Monthly, really denouncing and besmirching these people on the basis of the fact that they refuse to accept a specific leader, they refuse to accept a specific manifesto or program of action, that their objectives are quote-unquote unknowable. And we get back to the same kind of ultimately oppressive set of attitudes that led the British Empire to characterize some of their conquered peoples as anarchic and leaderless and acephalous and what have you. In reality, I think everyone watching this video knows, with a few Google searches, you can figure out exactly what the Yellow Vest protesters are unhappy about, exactly what their objectives are. It's not mysterious. It's true. They refuse to have a formal leader. They refuse to incorporate as a political party. They don't quite have a manifesto. I'm going to speak in a moment on the disadvantages of that. But it's completely insincere in this way to denigrate them, basically because they fail to resemble everything they despise about the mainstream French political process. All right, maybe I'll say that again. I find it reprehensible for journalists to criticize them for failing to resemble precisely the political system they openly say that they despise, that they openly say they want to transform. Their ideal of democracy, they're not only explaining to you, but they're demonstrating to you. It is, if you like, direct democracy, or a more direct form of democracy, in contrast to the parliamentary system that has served them one disappointment after another for so many elections in a row. Now, equality and inequality are very difficult topics. I was going to say they're difficult to talk about. They're very easy to morally grandstand about. It's very difficult to talk in practical terms about how to solve them. My girlfriend Melissa has heard me say many times how uncomfortable I would be raising my daughter in the Côte d'Azur in the south of France. South of France is a wonderful place to take a vacation. So is Disneyland. I don't want my daughter to grow up in Disneyland either. It is very strange walking through a society, literally walking through the streets, that to such an overwhelming extent is created by and for the millionaire class. It's the people who own yachts. It's the people who are gambling in those casinos. It's in a place like Nice and the Côte d'Azur, they don't feel like the minority. I mean, doubtless they are. Arithmetically, they dominate every element of society to such an extent that it leads us to question the same fundamental questions of how democracy should work that are already found in Aristotle. Ultimately, does government exist by and for the people, or does it exist by and for the rich, the aristocrats, whether or not they're formally called the aristocrats or they're merely the wealthiest portion of society? Now, I think what makes the outside world, I don't know, so uncomfortable with the example of the Gilets jaunes is precisely the sense that if this can happen in France, it can happen anywhere. If I told you there was an uprising of the disgruntled poor or even the disgruntled middle class in South Sudan, anyone would sit there and look at the footage and kind of in a smug way say, yes, well, I told you so. I always saw this coming. Sorry, if you just look at footage of what life is like right now in South Sudan, people are living in huts, they have dirt roads, they have objectively very hard conditions. And that makes it safer for us to sympathize with their political struggle if they're demanding change. And there's a strange kind of irony that the privileged white Western world has a great deal of trouble sympathizing with discontent, with really deep discontent and demands for radical political change when it comes from privileged white Western people. The middle class of France, even the poor of France, they're better off than the majority of people in American cities. I've recently been to Los Angeles, Detroit, Seattle. These places are awful. Life there, even for the middle class, is unbelievably horrible, even if you've got enough money to own a car and drive it back and forth between these, godforsaken suburbs. And as an atheist, I say godforsaken advisedly. It's very hard to behold. Even the Champs-Élysées themselves. And yet, this is precisely the challenge of 21st century politics. Technological progress has made it so comfortable for people to conform that demands for radical and fundamental change seem like lunacy. And I grew up as someone in Toronto, Canada, who was profoundly discontent in my society when anyone could point to the statistics and say, look, the poor have a better quality of life now than they have for any other period of time in the past. We have peace and prosperity and, effective government. I'm not going to say good government, in ways we never had before. Everyone has drinking water and electricity and, can watch sports on TV. The creature comforts of life have been provided, even to the poorest fifth of society, to put it that way, to an extent that they never were in the past. But, I think this again comes back to the fundamental questions raised by Aristotle. It's not conscionable to say that, the life of a disempowered peon in a despotism is something that has a price. That if only you're paid enough money or you're provided with a high enough standard of living, your status as a political animal, to use Aristotle's term, can be bought and sold. And yet we all, I think, feel the moral ambivalence of knowing that in reality it can be. People's complicity in unbelievably horrible political systems is something bought and sold. Every day, people in Saudi Arabia and even communist China, whatever you want to say, wake up and say, well, a revolution is in order, but not me, not now, not today. And what we've seen happen in France, and it still is happening right now in 2019, is a whole bunch of people who wake up. Yes, ultimately, the spark that set these events in motion is somewhat trivial. It was the rising price of gasoline and tax on gasoline. Some number of tens of thousands of people woke up and said, you know what, the system is so fundamentally bad that a revolution is in order, and you know what, it's going to be me. It's going to be now. It's going to be today. And I've yet to see a tally on how many people are sitting in prison because they participated in the Yellow Vest protests. I think it's interesting that we have that type of body count, that type of arrest count, the running tally of political prisoners when we talk about political repression in third world countries. And yet all of a sudden the math seems to get really hard to do when finally it is white Western people protesting in France. Okay, I've already run through 14 minutes of tape here. I wanted to say, though, the tragedy of the Yellow Vest protests is precisely the extent to which they are falling into this acephalous leadership, this romanticized notion of leaderless resistance, of insurrection without a manifesto, without a head, without... I myself have tried to get a definitive copy of their list of demands. And from what I can see, it doesn't exist. I got a news report today from France 24 claiming that there's a new list of demands produced by France's labor unions. And they dismissed it, saying it's more or less the same as the list provided by the Gilets jaunes, by the Yellow Jackets. So I, as someone with a background in political science, I would be interested in doing the comparison between the two lists, just like two different versions of a constitution, and pinning down exactly what's changed. And I was unable to do that. I couldn't get a definitive copy of either list. There are people on Facebook with profiles who more or less claim to be representatives of the Gilets jaunes movement. There are people who showed up at the government's own Great Debate lectures, more or less pretending or given the role of representing the Gilets jaunes. Who are these people? What do they represent? There's this tremendous impetus for change. There's this, and I completely sympathize. I mean, again, I've spent enough time in France, especially over the last 4 years, I guess 5-6 years now. I feel it. I also, I'm profoundly disappointed with Canadian society. I'm profoundly disappointed with French society. I also want change. And yet, it's completely self-defeating to have the demand for change being so strong and being out in front, and then afterwards there being a bit of a kind of cloud of confusion as to, okay, what changes are there exactly? I'm somebody who has just lately been putting a lot of time and effort into researching the politics of Laos and Cambodia, trying to get caught up after a couple of years not paying such close attention. Thailand also. I don't feel surprised when it's ultimately impossible by using Google in English on the internet to sort out quite what different political factions represent. But it is astonishing to me that France, that political events of enormous importance on the streets of Paris, France, have managed to recede behind a veil of inscrutability, have managed to become just as difficult to figure out. On the one hand, because of the leaderless nature of the movement or resistance being questioned or being interrogated here, and on the other hand, because of the collapse of the formal apparatus of professional journalism in our times. All movements struggle with the problem of a new leader taking over and subverting their purpose. Ultimately, that's what happened with the French Revolution several times over, but to simplify, this happened with the French Revolution. It ended up being led by Napoleon. Quote from Napoleon, he said, "The principles of the revolution have come to rest in me." Yeah, right. The principles of the revolution were democracy, and it ended up being dictatorship. It's a terrifying element of political history. However, in this romanticized acephalous sphere, we contrast that to the possibility of a movement that is in a perpetual state of mutiny, a perpetual state of directionlessness and leaderlessness, a movement that is in a sense always subverting itself, and where we can't even measure their success or failure relative to goals because they never did clearly set out the goals. So there's no way to win if you don't tell people clearly what it is you're playing the game for.